Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Adam Cross. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in SoCal, and today I'm with Daniel Johnson. And do you want to introduce
Sure, yeah,
yourself?
yeah. So I'm Daniel Johnson. I'm an associate marriage and family therapist still. Um, Taking the test pretty soon, I hope. And then, yeah, I'm also a therapist in Southern California, working with clients predominantly with OCD and depression. So,
Awesome. Okay. And preparing for your test, that's kind of a relevant topic for today too. So maybe
oh, yeah,
that'll,
right
yeah.
so.
The joys.
Well, right. I mean, the broad question today is how to remain, or the specific question rather, is how to remain Catholic
Mhm.
in grad school. But how to remain Catholic when you read junk, as many of those tests are. Um,
Yeah.
and you know, when you read or are around people who are full of opinions, propositions, and positions that don't align with our faith.
Hmm.
Um, and so, how
Yeah.
much of that can we engage with before? Um, what would be the relevant biblical analogy? You know, we become Lot's wife, and we begin to long for
Mm,
the flesh pots, as it were. So
yeah.
that's a tough question for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So this question actually came from a subscriber, a follower on YouTube, which greatly appreciate. And like Daniel said, the question was really how do we remain Catholic, and not even just remain, but how do we grow and form ourselves as Catholics when we are in grad school, and specifically for those who want to be Catholic therapists, how do we kind of remain this identity, especially when there's a lot of, like Daniel said, theories. There's a lot of stuff that we're coming up again that really is in direct opposition to our faith. And so I think, it'll be a short one today, but I think it'll be a good one with hopefully some ideas on how do I continue to form myself with the right stuff instead of the junk, like Daniel is talking about. And I guess I can start with my experience with grad school a little bit. So I actually went to and I won't drop names here. I mean, I guess it's not that hard to find out, but I went to a very, I guess, prominent Christian school for my master's in clinical psychology, and and the undergrad has a very good reputation for being Christian. For undergraduates, um, they go to chapel, they take theology courses. I think there's a curfew to dry campus. I mean, the faith is very much present on campus. Um, so I was kind of expecting that for the graduate program, which was at the same school, but then when I started the program, I quickly kind of realized that the place for Christianity was kind of hidden in the background somewhere. It was a 2-year program, and it really came to be that Christianity was kind of like a sub theme, maybe. It was like, oh, this is part of the school's mission statement, but we won't look at this too much. And the program was very secular in itself, and I was really disappointed by that. And it really kind of framed Christianity as more like, oh, this is maybe something we should consider at some point, but it's by no means, a framework or, our worldview or what defines us or anything like that. So um, it was very interesting, and I'm sure many people have this experience of really seeing or studying psychology through the secular lens where most everything is kind of relative, and um, you know we are almost the sum of our parts. And I don't know what your experiences were like with that, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean the my particular experience. I went to My two criteria for schools was, did the class schedule fit into my personal schedule, so weekend classes, and was it cheap? So I wasn't even looking for a Christian school. I gave up on the value of that pretty early on in the process of finding a school. And part of that was because I was confident that by this time in my life, I could navigate something ridiculously secular. And much to the credit of my grad school, many of the professors, most of the students were liberal in that classical sense of the term. The nice liberals that used to really value two or a variety of opinions. It was actually one of the very first things I was told during the interview process was, you represent a valuable voice that has been part of our culture, so of course you're welcome here.
Wow.
And so, I'm not confident that at this point, if I were to enter, there's such a hostility to traditional conservative voices, whatever adjective you want to put on there. And I don't even mean, necessarily conservative in the political sense. I just mean something that dissents from identity, defining people by their ethnic group, really. I'm sure there's a nice way to put that, but that seems to be what's going on. So yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate, I thought. Oddly enough, the professor I kind of butted heads with the most was the Catholic professor on the staff. So, it just worked out that way. So it's an interesting question, though, this, how do I navigate an environment that isn't Catholic and remain Catholic or Christian? And then how do I, and then the individual lessons and things, I think it's important to consider. And something that I really rested my intellectual life on was the intellectual tradition of the church predates the church. We rest a lot of our philosophical insights on the insights of Greeks and Romans that came before Christ. And so as an intellectual foundation, which is different than, an act of faith or the other components that go into Christian life, but simply as an intellectual project, I knew that the church's conclusions on certain moral issues or certain behaviors was founded on something other than just revelation. Now, revelation, of course, because God said it, is a really firm foundation, but it's nice to have 99% of that confirmed by human experience and human insight. And so that's, I was able to, if I had to quote something or I wanted to bring up something particularly that might be viewed as particularly Christian or contentious, I always just cited, I went and dug up Aristotle or Plato and made sure I cited them rather than the Bible, so that, there was a kind of secular foundation for this, or at least a non-Christian foundation for this. So that was my general strategy as far as the writing papers or having conversations with people on particular issues. So that was intellectually my foundation. But I think the real struggle, at least for me, and I imagine for many, was you're constantly kind of drinking from this well that lacks sustenance, that lacks complete truth and complete applicability to your own life. And so even though you keep drinking and drinking, it's like, drinking Dr. Pepper all day long, you're going to get dehydrated by the end of the week,
Yeah.
So that, I think, is one of the biggest struggles, is how do you keep your non-Catholic environment from draining you?
Yeah. And I think that is probably the biggest part, right? It's, we can go in, we're like, yeah, I have a good idea of, I have a good foundation in my faith, but over time that can really be weared down a little bit if we're constantly being told this is true, right? And everyone around us is like, yeah, that makes sense. It sounds silly, but it really does happen, right? There's this aspect of peer pressure and it could be the subtlest little change in definition. And I know we kind of both escaped gender theory, right? And, this idea of gender fluidity, I got just like a tiny bit of that in my practicum, but we really miss that. So, these subtle definitions, these subtle changes that we can encounter in grad school that oppose right? The reason of our faith, the rationale behind our faith, that, like you said, that can be draining. And that, so I guess that's a really good thing to address, is how do we answer that? How do we deal with that? Because yeah, I mean, we can kind of get lost in it, and I think if someone is in grad school and they kind of find themselves like, oh, like I am kind of getting lost in these definitions, or people redefining things. I think for, if you're in that position, that does make sense, right? Like, don't beat yourself up if you're like, oh, I've kind of forgotten some of these things, because we need to be continuously forming ourselves. What does our church teach? And I think, like Daniel says, it's, we have faith and reason, right? We have revelation, and we have what human reason can observe, and what has, made sense to us, that we can come to conclusions based on reason too. So I like that approach. So balancing faith and reason, reminding ourselves, and how to form ourselves in the face of this stuff. So where do we begin? I guess, how do we refresh ourselves if we're getting exhausted from drinking that Dr. Pepper all day long? I love Dr. Pepper, by the way, but sorry, but I like the analogy, right? So yeah, how do we refresh ourselves? How do we keep forming ourselves?
Yeah, it's as you were speaking, two avenues presented themselves to me. One would be the kind of the very specified question of, how does a graduate student of psychology get in touch with the church's wisdom that pertains to psychology? I think that's it's a more focused question, but I think that's really important. And then there's the broader kind of question of, how do I, as a Catholic, maintain the practice of the faith? How do I not get weary in the practice of the faith? And I think one example of this, it's not necessarily psychological, but I think it frequently happens with anybody who studies one of the harder sciences. You go, after a good science class, you go and you try to read chapter 1 of Genesis, and all of a sudden you've got this voice in your head telling you, no, the 7 days are absurd. They're not real 24 hours. Why would this be created before that? And so you're no longer reading a text. You're reading a text and having this argument in your head. And I think that can happen with the psychological sciences as well. We can have a client in front of us, or a case on a test that we're prepping for, and we're trying to discern the difference between what is the answer that is going to work for this test, or how to respond to this person. But we're also having this argument in our own mind between kind of the two worldviews that are difficult to integrate. So that's, to a degree, that's an observation to be had, is, how do I remain a practicing Catholic in the midst of this argument that's taking place in my mind?
Yeah, I definitely connect with doing that in grad school. Here, having topics brought up and being like, wait a minute, what is what does the church teach on this? What have I encountered otherwise? So that definitely makes sense. And I think one of the biggest things that stands out to me in staying refreshed or staying hydrated within grad school is having good Catholic community too. I think, that might sound secondary, but having people you can talk to about these things as they come up. And I guess when I say Catholic community, I mean people who really are pursuing the truth as well, right? Pursuing living their faith, living as disciples. To have people like that in your life that will question these things, that will, that you can talk to, that you can spend time with, but also people that you can be like, hey, what do you think about this? This is what's coming up in class. And I think, like you mentioned, Daniel, I remember in grad school, one of my biggest, and it wasn't, very dramatic, but my biggest contention was actually with the professor who probably identified the most as Christian. And, especially as Catholics, was very focused on fertility, in vitro fertilization, right? These are things that society has really deemed as good. It's, you're struggling, so this is a good thing that you can turn to, right? And especially a lot of Christians will even embrace that too. But as Catholics, we're like, okay, what's going on in vitro, right? The embryos, that are discarded, right, or frozen. The lack of dignity for this human life. That we believe, and science teaches believes at conception. So there was a lot of those type of things that weren't even coming up in class, right? It's just, this is a good, right? We're going to talk about this as a good, and I'm sure nowadays it might even be worse than in vitro, right? That's posed as a good. But those are the biggest things. So being able to talk through that with my friends, you're in a whole cohort that's like, oh yes, this is a beautiful story, and I'm like, I feel for this person. Like, I feel for the struggle of infertility. I don't want to be um, inconsiderate or mean, but I also can't agree with this action as well. So having friends to talk those things through that I knew were on the same page and kind of walking with me was really, really helpful during all of that, because I felt alone in that.
Right. Right. Well, and I think that's one of the interesting things about um, the internet right now, is that a lot of Catholic clinicians are able to connect with each other. When 5 years ago, I don't think the technology may have been there, but the movement kind of wasn't taking place. I see it kind of percolating all over the country. There's this podcast, there's 3 others I can think of. And if you want to find those, that's your job. Stay here. But this is the best of all of them, for sure.
Of course. Uh-oh.
Oh, I'll wait till you click record. Yeah. Oh, there we go. All right, Bene. Yeah, it's interesting that right now there is this kind of renaissance taking place in the Catholic community nationwide, to try to have this community of clinicians who are able to talk to each other. So if you're looking, obviously this question came through YouTube, but there's CatholicTherapist.com, Catholic Psychological Association. I'm working on building an online community right now over at, I think it's Smart Catholics, but there'll be a subgroup that I'll be in charge of. And the idea is really to begin fostering this awareness in kind of the broader Catholic population about how psychological resources can work. So there is that growth taking place. I think another thing that any student of psychology has to do is really get some good resources. You mentioned earlier about having a framework in order to approach these questions. And there's any number of books on Catholic or Christian anthropology, which would be a good resource. I particularly, I read the Summa because I was trained in that, but I think much of the theology of the body stuff talks about Catholic anthropology. You can easily find summaries of that from Romano Cesaro, I think is his name, and then Paul Vitz out of Divine Mercy University, and then any of these kind of Catholic anthropology books is a good starting place, I think, on the intellectual side of things.
Yeah. There's a lot of reading in grad school,
right?
But and I guess looking back, it would have been nice if I had done this, and I think I did it to some extent, but to almost have your own curriculum, right? I know that this topic is coming up. I know that this class focuses on this. Is there some sort of Catholic resource and literature on this that's talking about, like you say, the anthropology or the philosophy? Is there something I can keep in mind, to almost do that research to, like Daniel said, you said, our church is faith and reason, right? So to really look at the wealth of wisdom that the church offers, from 2,000 years, and even like you said before that, that were rooted in this reason, as well as divine revelation that God has spoken to us, that we can turn to the deposit of faith and the wisdom that is there to, be our companions as we're faced with some of these things, right? Like, especially with gender theory, coming up, to look at theology of the body, to look at, what does our church really teach on sexuality and, I'm blanking on the word, but the fact that it's too early in the morning, but that men and women complementarity, right? That the sexualities complement each other, and they have to be different, right? For that procreative and unitive act to be there. So I mean, these things are so relevant nowadays, and the church is just, I guess, overflowing with these resources. So to maybe do your own research and say, what can I take from the church? What can I be reading? Not to overwhelm yourself, but to, what can I kind of have with me as we go into this topic in class or this course? And there's a million podcasts out there, right? There's a lot of YouTube videos. Father Mike Schmitz has short ones. Matt Fradd. I love Catholic Stuff You Should Know. They have all these topics that really can be very, very relevant to your core studies, which I think can be really helpful. And I think it's also a really great time for apologetics. That when I was in grad school, that was where I was at, because I was facing all these different things, and I was like, okay, let's get into this. How can I talk about this? How can I give a reason for the hope that is within me, right? First Peter. So I was kind of looking at that framework and saying, how can I defend my faith, right? Not to apologize, but to be able to give that defense when I could. And that was really helpful. So I turned to people like Dr. Peter Kraft, Scott. I love Scott Hahn. I was reading a lot of Scott Hahn in college and grad school. Fulton Sheen, was awesome. Some more contemporary theologians, but I thought they were really helpful in addressing some of these issues that were coming up in the classes I was taking.
No, it's an interesting thing finding the resources, and like so many things, there's no one depository for all of this. You do have to kind of hunt around a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine the internet being what it is, there'll be some concentration of these resources in the future, but right now it really is kind of poking around and seeing what you can find. But yeah, I think as far as authors go, Peter Kraft is another, and Scott Hahn both are great resources for this kind of, you want to give yourself a touchstone, so something that draws you back into the Western tradition, rather than whatever strange offshoot happens to be cropping up at your grad school. And so, you don't want to overwhelm yourself. You're in this program, you got to answer these questions the way they're being asked to be answered. But you need that little touchstone of, what really is the reality here, and how do I, and this is, I think this is the part where a lot of students and a lot of clinicians kind of give up the struggle. It's one thing to read about Catholic anthropology. It's another thing to know how to practically communicate that in the context of a client session.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean teach them about Catholic anthropology. I mean, it's difficult to learn how to respond to a very specific problem or question or interaction in a way that is reflective of Catholic anthropology. So it's not about teaching them. In fact, therapy is rarely about teaching the client, but it is about authentically responding to them in a way that is informed by the broader tradition. And that's where I can't think of any better resource really than a mentor, a teacher or another clinician, even a wise friend. I mean, any number of things I've brought into the room are because of conversations I've had with intellectuals in the field, not even necessarily psychological folks, but just kind of Catholic intellectuals, talking about how to interact and help somebody experience healing through that interaction. And so that, I think, is probably the best resource as far as how do you do this stuff. You got to have somebody show you. Now, maybe there are other resources out there. In fact, I think Divine Mercy just came out with something about a month ago to help clinicians be very practical, but I
Yeah.
haven't read it yet. So
Yeah, so that might be a great resource to check out. But yeah, I think that's key, and having people that you can, yeah, having a mentor, people you can check in with, even having a spiritual director, to process some of these things in your own life. Okay, this is coming up in my, prayer life, and run it by someone that you can really trust in discussing these topics. And that might be kind of the last thing. So we have talked about community, right? Having time to refresh ourselves, having people to vent to a little bit, talk through these things, turning to resources, and I'd say even with resources, it doesn't have to be giant books because you're doing a lot of studying. It could be articles, it could be videos, but having something to kind of, almost bounce off of, right? This is what the church believes, something solid from the, you know, um, credible sources in our church. And then the last thing was, I think would be, or second to last thing would be the mentor. And then the last thing I think is prayer, right? Going through grad school, really building an interior life and that relationship with our God, I think is really important. And that's something that in grad school can be thrown by the wayside because I need to study. I need to write this paper. I need to read 3 books.
well, we get inundated with in especially in psychology grad school, we get inundated with this concept of self-care.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's a nice thing that we enter an industry whose primary focus is to reduce anxiety. So the life of the psychology student is a lot easier, I think, than other grad students. But it's easy for the Catholic to forget that
Mm-hmm.
um, we already very much have a rhythm of self-care integrated into Catholic life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can read all these articles about taking a digital Sabbath once a week. Well, that's easy to incorporate with your practice of the Sabbath already.
Yeah.
That would be an easy thing to add to that, would be to leave your phone at home. Hopefully you know where your church is by now, so you don't need to maps. But
Yeah.
hopefully your church is open these days, just to date this video a little bit. But anyways, um, so yeah, I think that's really important, is maybe developing a kind of authentic self-care inspired by the practice of the faith, paying attention to the feast days, integrating a daily kind of prayer. Um, and honestly, I can't, it's hard for me to exaggerate the importance of an examination of conscience, both for the clinician, but for every one of my clients too. It's
Yeah.
something that comes up in almost every relationship I have in a therapeutic context, is
Mm.
carving out that time, not only to kind of do a thought journal of my actions through the day, but also to take into account my relationship to the divine.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's worth cultivating that for oneself, so that
Mm-hmm.
you can authentically communicate that to your clients.
Yeah.
And it's a valuable tool for almost any psychological problem.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. To build in that self-awareness, that building that relationship with yourself, that it's not just Eastern practices of mindfulness, but it's really, even our Catholic um, interior life, and being mindful of what's going on with us, body, mind, and soul, and our connection to the divine, like you say. So building that up. And I think, there's so many devotions we could talk about, but I think, to touch upon a few, going to scripture, something like Lectio Divina, what is God speaking to me through this? The sacraments, going to mass, going to confession, like you said, even, daily examine in that, Eucharistic adoration, the rosary, and then even just spiritual, writing or journaling, accompanying spiritual reading. There's so much good stuff that can come up. And I think all of that, taking all these things to prayer, taking what we're hearing in grad school to prayer, the joys, the difficulties, really making it personal, like, okay, I'm facing these things in school, and I'm learning about these things, but like, what does that mean to you? What is, what is God even trying to say through this struggle, but making time for that kind of reflection and that type of dialogue with God. I know, I say that as someone who is not perfect at that. Silence is hard for me, to cultivate that and build it. But I know just how important it is, when I really am missing it and things get kind of, are bearing that. So cultivating that interior life within all this is, I think, probably the most important thing we can do. So
it would be the source of great peace in the midst of the conflict or the implied conflict that comes with teacher-student relationships, or even peers of different
yeah,
political persuasions, as it were. Gone, at least at the moment, are the days where people with dissenting opinions can be welcomed as part of a conversation.
mm,
And I really feel for the grad students enrolled at the moment. As Adam said, we both kind of just right at the end of I think my last semester, I started hearing about microaggressions, and now that philosophy has really blossomed into something quite horrific uh, in our cultural life and in our political life. And I can only imagine it is truly a difficult experience for most students these
mhm,
days. So find these touchstones in your life, cultivate in yourself a Catholic awareness.
yeah,
I think my own mentor, one of the best things she ever said was just go to spiritual direction as often as you can.
yeah.
That was key for her and useful for me as well. So
With a solid spiritual director. I know that
yes.
sometimes is hard to find too, depending on where you're at. But yeah, that is critical to have that good mentor. And within all this, it comes back to this concept, of reason, of the philosophy behind it, that there is so much that we learn in school that kind of tells us that, truth is relative, right? That, we can decide what's true, and it's kind of whatever the culture is shoving in our face predominantly at the time, but that our church says differently, right? That truth is a person, that there is something greater than ourselves, that truth comes from, that there is an objectivity, and we do have a purpose, and we do have a creator, and we do have something to lean back on, that we're made for within all these things. And I think that was helpful for me in grad school. Is like, okay, yeah, it's not just what society defines, right? There's something greater than that we can turn to in prayer, right? For mentorship, for wisdom, and even for that community as well, to look for those things. So I think these are great tips, to get started, and um, yeah. And if you're not in grad school, well, then you still have some really great resources to be continually forming yourself. So
Well, and that's an important point, is that uh, Aristotle's pretty clear. Your 30s and your 40s are when people naturally are ready and disposed to think about the soul and human
mm,
behavior. Um, and oddly enough, he thinks that that's a prerequisite before you think about root behavior in politics. So if only
mm,
our politicians would learn ethics before they would go practice their craft, but be that as it
yeah.
may. Yeah, a vestige of that awareness is present even in our
Mm,
Constitution, as far as the age at which we
mm,
allow people to run for office. We
yeah.
want them to have sufficient life experience so that they understand the soul and human behavior and the interaction between the two. So it's a worthy thing to be aware of the fact that there are resources out there,
Mhm.
that there are good clinicians out there, that there are
Yeah.
clinicians who are deep into their faith and into the cultivation of their relationship with God,
Mm.
so that they can have a healing relationship with their clients.
Yeah. And there's some solace in knowing, like you're saying, that I think I learned way more in supervision and in the room with clients, than I did in the classroom. And I learned the definitions, the memorization. I learned a lot of good stuff in the courses, and even my grad school. It was a really good education for
Mhm.
for what I was studying. But the Christian approach, the personal approach, the really how to do therapy happens, in real time and having a
Yes.
supervisor. Right.
And I think that's the experience of almost every clinician, is that
Yeah.
the real work of helping people heal or being available to witness their healing really is done in the room with clients. It's done with
Hmm.
supervisors. It's the classroom material takes a lot of translating into action, and that
Yeah.
translation really takes place at your practicum and your
Hmm.
internship. So
Yeah.
if your classes have you down, just
Hmm.
go searching for a good internship.
Yeah. 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 And a solid supervisor too. Yeah. Good.
Yes.
Well, these are some great resources, and I'm curious to hear what people think. And if you have any experiences you want to share, please leave a comment below. Give this video a like and hit that subscribe button wherever it is, whatever corner it's at. And you can follow Daniel at Color of Thought. He has his podcast, Color of Thought. His website, you can check out his resources too. And like he said, he's putting together kind of a compendium of some of those good Catholic resources. So that's exciting. Yeah.
Slowly and surely.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for watching. And please reach out with any comments or questions that you may have. And we'll see you next time.
You ask a question, we may just answer it right here. So.
Yeah. Like this one. All right. Well, thanks again and God bless.
God
Bye.
bless.